yeah, some constituency. So please feel free to get in touch with Connie if you want to have their recording. Okay, so let me introduce Professor Brent Crosson, who has a PhD from University of California, Santa Cruz from 2014. And he's trained as a kind of anthropologist, both of religion and secularism, that works in a broader area of the Caribbean. But he's got kind of a very interesting kind of itinerary, I think, because he has been looking at questions of kind of legal justice, science and religion. So really trying to also reshape the interdisciplinarity, I would say, between this kind of field of studies. He was before, he's now a, sorry, you're an assistant or an associate already? You're assistant in your, yeah, assistant professor in the religion, Department of Religious Studies at the university.
Yeah, they're supposed to make me an associate, I just found out, but I'm still an assistant.
Not yet. I've heard of the grapevine, so I had a moment of like, can I call you? And so soon officially to be an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And he was, before that, it was also a Mellon dissertation completion fellow at the University of Santa Cruz, and also Ruth Landers Memorial Postdoctoral Fellow in Cultural Anthropology at NYU. He has written this book, as we said in a minute, but also different articles on method and theory in the study of religion. But I particularly wanted to highlight a special issue in Ethnos 2019 that he kind of edited, entitled "What Possessed You? Spirit, Property and Political Sovereignty at the Limit of Possession." And this was one of the first things that I read, by the way, by by Brent, to keep it collegial. And it was very, very interesting introduction, I would say, like, you know, kind of where you really also see how his work has been charting new terrain and new conversation of this kind of emerging areas that some of us know on political theologies in the plural, and the relation between anthropology and political theology in the plural. I also, lastly, I wanted to highlight a work that came out in 2020 in Anthropological Quarterly entitled "Don't Study People, Disentanglement and the Danger of Studying Others in Trinidad and in Anthropology," where I think like there is, again, quite a lot in conversation with what I would say, you know, theory of personhood of Marion Strathern, but also I know Googling and reading this, I know that one of your main interlocutors has been, I think her name is Vita. And I've been thinking, of course, as free association to Obeah, Vita work on the figure of Catarina. And what you're doing is also in conversation and very different. So what I'm wanting to highlight in the introduction, and that's it, don't want to go too long, but it's like you are taking at the heart some central tenet of anthropological thinking and trying to bring it in other directions. So you're in a way also queering some of these fields, and I really salute you for that, because it's very interesting. And today we are discussing the new book, Experiment with Power, Obeah and the Remaking of Religion in Trinidad, which came out with University of Chicago Press in 2020. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Napolitano. And yes, so feel free to call me Brent. You know, you don't have to call me Professor Crosson. And thanks, Connie, for organizing this, and thanks, Fatima, for responding. So I think I'll just offer a few remarks. I'm going to time myself to make sure I don't go over. And I had some prepared remarks, but I think I decided just to improvise because I got excited about some of the conversations I was having with Professor Napolitano about sovereignty and political theology, and she sent me this introduction to it's in social analysis, I think, is that right? About theopolitics. And so I was just reflecting on that in light of the events that the book is about, and in light of current events within and beyond Trinidad. So I wanted to talk about the question of violence, different forms of violence, the relationship between violence and the law, violence and policing and religion. I think for me, I go back not to Carl Schmitt, for political theology, but to Walter Benjamin. And so to kind of give a lens, I wanted to talk about these three kinds of violence that Walter Benjamin enumerates in Critique of Violence: law-preserving violence, law-making violence, and divine violence, and how Obeah and the ways that spiritual workers talk about power fits into that or not. I recently wrote a piece about the insurrection in Washington, D.C., and I used Benjamin to think through it. And so I've also been thinking recently in terms of that. And I start off that piece by, kind of taking a jab at people who are kind of shocked or morally outraged that Trump would uphold, law or tout law and order while at the same time inciting this insurrection or coup. And I really make the point that, Benjamin shows how these two kinds of violence, law-preserving violence, which is the rhetoric of, maybe Biden or other center-right kinds of people, is really linked to law-making violence, and that law-making violence does, break the law, declare a state of exception, or kind of seem to transcend the rules, but that it's in the name of imposing law and order. And that's why lawmaking violence is often, fascist. And so that there's no contradiction in Trump upholding law and order and inciting a coup or an insurrection that would seek to declare an exception in order to impose a certain vision of law and order. That made me think about, back to the state of emergency that the book opens with in 2011 in Trinidad, in which the government, declared a state of exception. And these are built into constitutions, right? As the epilogue shows, there's all these freedoms in the Constitution can be suspended when the government declares an existential threat in a state of emergency. But this state of emergency, this state of exception in which people could be, summarily detained and whatnot, and public gatherings were outlawed, was declared in the name of law and order. It was declared in the name of restoring law and order, or imposing law and order on an unruly or ungovernable situation, mainly by targeting lower class Black areas. And so I think it's worth thinking about how this idea of law preservation, which is all about upholding the law and rules and order, is always linked with lawmaking violence, which breaks the law or declares exceptions, or they're linked. They're often seen. Sometimes they seem opposed in the media. For example, with the insurrection in DC, there was this opposition between this defense of U.S. democracy and constitutionalism and this supposed, fascist tyranny of Trump. But these things are linked. They're two sides of the same coin. And so that made me reflect, where does Obeah fit in this? Is Obeah, my question was, is Obeah just lawmaking violence? Because Obeah does, in the spiritual work that I'm talking about, does seek to violate norms or break rules or invert norms in order to seek justice, to maybe enforce a kind of justice. However, Benjamin proposes a third alternative that he calls, well, let's translate it as divine violence. And divine violence is a very difficult thing to think about. I don't think anybody really agrees upon it. And again, this is where Benjamin differs from Schmitt, because Schmitt is really upholding what Benjamin would call lawmaking violence, but Benjamin is showing how lawmaking violence actually is the handmaiden of this law-preserving violence that Schmidt is critiquing, this liberal kind of constitutionalism. So, but Benjamin has this, so he shows those are two sides of the same coin, but he has a third alternative, divine violence. And he says this comes to abolish or, again, it breaks the law, but it doesn't come to establish the law, a new law and order, or the same law and order. And so in the article that I wrote about the insurrection, I thought about it as abolition, as a kind of violence that's about abolition rather than about reform or upholding an existing regime of law. So my question that I was thinking about in that is Obeah, is what's, this violation or countervention of norms, is it divine violence, or is it just lawmaking violence? And I think I don't have a set answer to that question, but it made me start to think about what is divine violence. And so I think that also led me to re-question what sovereignty is. And I know that you've been having questions about sovereignty, and so I thought I would just throw out some of those thoughts. And I think Obeah does help us to think sovereignty differently, as well as science and law, and we can talk about those things, and race and religion as well. But I think divine violence and Obeah made me think about sovereignty not as what power does, but the power not to do, the power, and this made me think about divine power as more of a roadblock than as in a capacity to do something. And so I thought about that in terms of the ways that divinity and sovereignty have been conflated. And I think it's important that Obeah is both, the work of healing and its affliction too. And so I think the experience of divine violence could be something more like affliction or frustration or a roadblock, rather than a typical experience that we would that we might consider, in empowerment in the typical sense. In this way, Obeah can be both affliction and healing. And so it made me think about a theopolitical world in which affliction is not the property of an other, but affliction is a sign of divinity itself. And I think that is pretty commonplace in a lot of Afro-Caribbean religions. Not just Afro-Caribbean religions, there's other, a lot of examples of this. But this idea that somehow affliction is the doorway into divine power. And so I was recently teaching Elizabeth Perez's book, and she talks about it as, well, it's her interlocutor Ashabi that talks about it as ouch and boing, and that people come into the religion more through ouch and boing than through, wanting to enter the religion. And in a certain way, this is a mark of authority, because people will often say, from Cuba to Trinidad, elsewhere, that they didn't want to have anything to do with African religions, and that they came into it because they were afflicted in some way, because maybe the Orishas wouldn't stop bothering them, wouldn't leave them alone. They had some kind of disease or misfortune or a roadblock really in their life. And so I guess I'm proposing to think about divine violence and sovereignty in that way, less as an imposing of a certain order, or as a capacity to do something, but as a capacity to not do something, to stop, and so I think, I think Obeah can be thought of as that, and that's why it's so generative to think about it as both affliction and healing. That's also where it gets it trips me up, trips people up. You know, it's hard to think about those things in one breath, because I think maybe perhaps I'm used to inhabiting a theopolitical world in which those things are separated into different agents. And it's hard to think those things together. But I think that can lead to a different theopolitical reckoning about sovereignty and divinity and justice. So those are my kind of thoughts coming out of reading Professor Napolitano's introduction to theopolitics, thinking back with Benjamin, thinking back through the state of emergency in Trinidad and how lawmaking violence and law preserving violence really were interlinked there. And whether there is an alternative, you know, and whether Obeah is just this kind of vigilante law making violence, or whether it presents a vision of sovereignty or divinity that doesn't isn't the handmaiden of law preserving violence. And I think that's an open question for me. And Obeah is not just one thing, of course. Nothing is just one thing. But you know, I think those are really generative things to think through. And so, Professor Napolitano's introduction to that special issue was really helpful. And so I think this is an emerging conversation within anthropology. And also I'm coming to understand theology and religious studies. And so I think, and also I'm interested in bringing science studies into the conversation. I think we could, you know, learn from, I've definitely learned a lot from history of science and science studies. And I was brought there by, you know, the spiritual workers who talked about science, and the ways that I had to, you know, that that they made me rethink science really. And that led me to kind of go back into other, you know, in academia, like other critical reexaminations of science. But it was really in order to try to address this question about Obeah, which I guess I should say, I'm using Obeah without giving people any background who might not have, you know what Obeah, or have read the book or are familiar with it. But, you know, Obeah, which was criminalized across the Anglophone British colonized Caribbean, initially starting in relation to a slave rebellion, Tacky's rebellion, or the Coromantee War in the 1700s, but then being kind of eventually criminalized as the laws often defined as any assumption of supernatural power. And so interesting thing is that in the Anglophone Caribbean, science or high science can be a kind of synonym for Obeah. Although people also distinguish between high science and Obeah in different ways, which we could talk about, especially I think in Jamaica more maybe. But there's this kind of lexical equivalence between science and Obeah that has really fascinated people. And so part of the book is also reckoning with broader ideas about rationality, science, and African religions and race, and this history of the criminalization of Obeah and African identified religions. And also the ways that Obeah was used to criminalize a kind of broad spectrum of subaltern people in the Anglophone Caribbean, including people who, well, what I identify as Christians or Hindus in particular. And we can talk about that too. There's the interlude in so the book is structured in 3 sections: the depths, which really deals with questions of ethics, the dead, the presence of the dead, justice, the nations, which maybe is more about race relations, race and religion, and then the heights, which is about that question of science and Obeah. So I think that's all I really have to say. I hope that was, like I said, I'm a little sleep deprived, but I hope that was somewhat coherent. And I look forward to the conversation. And thanks again for everybody who attended and who made this possible.
I have to unmute myself before talking. Thank you very much for this kind of very provocative, again, sort of introduction to your work. And I give the floor now to Fatima Siwaju to just respond. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. Um, I'm really honored to be responding to such a theoretically rich and beautifully written ethnography. And this monograph appealed to me not only as an anthropologist in training with a theoretical interest in religion in the Americas, but also as someone born and raised in Trinidad. So I'm not sure if the organizers knew that I'm actually Trinidadian. Um, and also someone with a deep family connection to the spiritual Baptist tradition, which Brent identifies as part of the threefold path of African religion in Trinidad. So I thought it would be remiss of me not just to include some of that personal connection, because reading this evoked so many things in me as someone born and raised and having very deep connections with that spiritual tradition. So actually my grandmother, who was actually raised in the Church of England in Grenada, migrated to Trinidad in her youth and embraced the spiritual Baptist tradition in the impoverished suburbs of Port of Spain, which is the capital of Trinidad. So my mother was raised as a spiritual Baptist before she herself converted to Islam in the 1970s. So the spiritual trajectories of my mother and my grandmother have very much animated my childhood, memories that I have since revisited as I'm reading this book. So questions of morning rituals, the experience of working, or as we say in Trinidad, walking Obeah, spirit possession, all these things are like an everyday reality for the people I grew up with. And the veracity of these experiences was something that was actually never challenged. So I think one of my first interests for Brent would be how and why Trinidad, why Trinidad in particular, what drew you to the southern town that you refer to as Rio Moro. Yeah, so this is intensely personal for me, and I'm really interested to be responding to this book. Actually, I told my mom, because I called my mom while I was reading this book to have a conversation with her about the spiritual Baptist tradition. And I told her, like, I wish this book would be compulsory reading in Trinidadian schools and universities, because I think it would force Trinidadians to confront our deeply rooted colonial false consciousness, as you call it, right? And I would go even so far as to say that one of the kind of greatest enduring casualties of the European imperial project and its attendant ills, white supremacy, racial capitalism, has been this monopoly on morality by Western Christianity that has largely gone unchallenged, right? And has allowed spiritual practices like Obeah to be maligned as morally transgressive, right? But what I appreciate about your project is you're not trying to redeem Obeah in the consciousness of Trinidadians or of people in the Americas more broadly, right? I applaud you for allowing your research to be guided by your interlocutors and to present us with the ambivalence, a term that is highly generative in your text, of the spiritual practices that fall under the umbrella of Obeah. Moving beyond an attempt to redeem Obeah, to sanitize it of any pretensions to harm, and to project it as a purely healing-oriented praxis, instead, you draw attention to intricate ways in which Obeah disrupts the religion-magic divide, while also troubling the notion of religion as a pure force of good invested in ethical subject making. So you make a key point on page 46 when you state, and I quote that, rather than deny that Obeah can imply harm, this chapter questions a more basic premise of the arguments against Obeah's legalization as a religious practice, that any religion can be separated from the exercise of harming force in the first place, end quote. So that in itself, I think, was one of the key moments in the text, and is really constitutes one of what for me was such an original contribution by you to kind of trouble this divide, not only trouble this divide, but trouble the notion that religion in itself can exist in this sanitized space that is separated from violence and the use of violence. So in your discussions on religion and violence, spiritual praxis and justice, the locations and dispensations of power, whether this power be legal, spiritual, or state power, you continually draw our attention to this ambivalence, the contestations over ethics, authority, and morality. I was very impressed by the way in which you shift almost seamlessly between scales, from the rural cosmopolitan reality of Rio Moro to the national debates on crime and justice, to global debates on religion, law, and violence. I applaud you for making it look easy, right? For leading me as a reader in a way that these connections between the local, the global, and the national don't seem far-fetched or improbable, but rather quite evident. I also like the way that you resist what I term this definitional urge, right? This urge that we as researchers have to define and delimit the practices of any religious tradition. And in this case, you're resisting the urge to define the practices of Obeah, right? And rather your notion of repertoires allows us to grasp the blurred boundaries and the spaces of contention that exist between Obeah, within Obeah as a spiritual practice. I was also drawn to the entanglements of race and class in the Anglophone Caribbean context that your research highlights. So the fact that in Trinidad, because we're talking, the book talks a lot about anti-Blackness, you know, the attacks on what you term lower class Blackness, but the reality is almost all the lawmakers, the police officers, the people in power look like the people who are being oppressed, right? So this is a country that is about 50% identifies as Afro-Creole or Black. And you have the main arms of the law, the people who are in government, the people who exist in civil society are also Black. But yet the people who permeate this underclass of people who are deemed, you know, deserving of violence at the hands of the state are also Black, right? So I think it allows you to really think about the entanglements of race and class in a post-colonial society in a very different way to the United States context, right? So you hit on something when you refer to this notion of lower class Blackness. There are forms of Blackness that are encouraged, right? There's the forms of Blackness that are sanitized through Christianity and middle class respectability, right? Which comes into contention with this lower class Blackness that is associated with moral degradation, backwardness, and is really far removed from the respectable Christian Blackness that the Afro-Creole political elite is trying to project. But what I thought was interesting may not be too relevant to the discussion we're having here, but it really got me thinking about the subcultures of this quote unquote lower class Blackness that is used as the foundation for the construction of national culture, right? So here I'm thinking of Deb Thomas's work on the folklorization of Blackness within the cultural sphere by the political elite in Jamaica, right? And the Creole nationalist paradigm that renders this forms of Blackness, that tries to contain lower class Blackness as something almost picturesque and folkloric. And so Obeah troubles that containment, right? By its, pretensions is the wrong word, but by its employment of power that upsets and unsettles the clear realm of state and judicial power. So I thought that was really interesting, and maybe we could talk about that more if it's relevant. So I have a few questions, purely out of my own curiosity. So bear with me because I was so taken up with this work. I wondered if you could speak more about the notion of religion as a race-making project in Western modernity, right? So I'm intrigued by this argument because I think that it is inextricably linked to ideas about the limits and excesses of Blackness with regards to the Western liberal project of citizenship in the Americas. And I'm thinking of Christina Sharp, her book called In the Wake, on Blackness and being, and she talks about Blackness as being anagrammatical, right? And the ways in which it unsettles the modern liberal project in the Americas. And I feel like the discussion of Obeah is so pertinent to that because this, in the ways in which it was delegitimized, made illegal, the ways in which it unsettles people's, you know, especially Black, I feel like the people who are most opposed to Obeah in Trinidad are Black middle class Christians, right? So the ways in which they try to distance themselves from it, almost as it disrupts this pretension to a model middle class citizen, right? And just linking that back to the constant ways in which Blackness disrupts and unsettles this sanitized, moralized liberal project, with regards to citizenship and belonging in the Americas. I thought maybe it might be interesting to talk about that more. Another question I had was linked to the notion of Obeah as a technology of justice making, specifically with regard to the case that you highlight about the extrajudicial killing of Arlena and her friends in Rio Moro, right? This notion of spiritually enacted justice with the politics of subaltern peoples. And it got me thinking of an argument made by Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, where he says that, he argues that the colonized emerges himself in the mystical realm as an escape from colonial reality, given that this mystical realm is one in which he has civilized status. And Fanon goes on to argue that as liberation struggles take root amongst the colonized, these ritual practices, which oftentimes invokes trance-like states and possession, decreases. The colonized, prepared to fight the colonized in armed struggle, no longer needs to transfer his trauma to religious rites, given that he has faced the source of his alienation. So I wondered what we can make of this material approach by Fanon in light of your emphasis on the justice-making possibilities of Obeah's experiments with power. And I remember thinking, reading that paragraph by Fanon, that he has a conceptual blind spot through this materialist approach, because very much he forgets the Haitian Revolution and the ways in which that landmark moment for Black people in the Americas is catalyzed by a spiritual encounter, right? And so it's something that troubled me, and thinking of it's something that's troubled me reading about this years ago when I was in coursework, but thinking about reading your book kind of reignited that why is that materialist approach of religion just being this almost opiate that allows the people to deal with oppression, and when they reach their full potential, they will shed religion? Yeah, I'm rambling, but I just want us to think more about that, right? Let me try to be quick because I know I've been speaking for a while. Number 3, what I was thinking about here is there a possibility for the high science practices that constitute Obeah to exist outside this ambivalent space between healing and harm, fair and empowerment, legality and illegality, good and bad? Or is that liminality and ambivalence required for Obeah to continue thriving within the post-colonial Caribbean, right? As a tack-on question to this, I wondered if the Obeah's kind of pervasive association with harm and evil intentions in the collective unconsciousness within the Caribbean, is it due to the ways in which it was historically employed by the enslaved in order to resist their continued oppression, right? So does the circumstances of oppression, the need to actually attack your master with quite malevolent practices, almost as in your fight for freedom, right? Does that then create the conditions through which these practices become more associated with evil and malevolence, right? And this is a very bad analogy, but this was a close analogy I could think of when I think of Jewish communities in medieval Europe becoming moneylenders and stigmatized for money lending when Christians refused to trade in interest, and that became almost like a niche profession for Jewish people to engage in. And then they become the victims of that own, like, of their kind of the fact that they were almost socially forced into that position, right? So I know it's a bad analogy, but it just got me thinking of really the connections between the enslaved past and the emancipated present, and the ways in which the spiritual practices of Obeah are molded through socioeconomic and political circumstance. Finally, I just have a quick question about language and the ways in which you represent Trinidadian vernacular dialect in your text. For my master's research, I did research in Trinidad, and I remember being very conflicted about how I represented the speech of my interlocutors. And I think I chickened out and then kind of approximated it to standard English. And I've since regretted that because I feel like the richness and the as someone myself, like when I speak with my family, it's in full Trinidadian vernacular dialect. As someone who I consider that my first language, right? I wondered whether that was like a source of like conflict for you, how you represent this language, because the richness of Trinidadian and the expressiveness of it, I think, is best captured by trying to approximate the dialect in the text. So just a few words on that. I'll stop there, but these questions could never really, or my comments could never really encapsulate the breadth of your work. It's such an ambitious project, so richly and theoretically expansive, and I'm so honored to have been selected or invited to respond to your work. So thank you so very much.
Well,
thanks so much.
Serendipity of connections that create thinking in common. Now I'll give it Brent, the Professor Crosson, Brent, the floor. I'll just say, if people want to ask questions, so please raise your hand, because you are at different pages. I can't see everybody here. So we'll give the floor to Brent to respond. And then if you have questions or comments, just raise your hand. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for those comments. That's a really rich response, and something that there's things in there that I'll think about for a while. I'm not sure if I can get to all of it, but I'll see what I can get to here. I'll start with the last one first, because that's fresh in my head. And yeah, there's a number of things that kind of keep me up at night. You know, wake up at 3 a.m. and I'm like, you know, shit, like I should have done that differently. There, you know, and the thing about like how to render the way that people speak is a big one. Yeah, I mean, I love the English Creole of Trinidad, and that's a source of theory. Like I think I write about it somewhere in there, where it's because words are used differently. You know, like work. You know, you said wuk. You know, W-U-K. I could have written work W-U-K to denote that there's something more than what our standard ideas of work are that are going on here, and that wuk has all these other connotations. So in a way, I went back and forth, and there's I think there's one photo caption that still kind of wasn't, hadn't been as standardized, and I looked at it and it kind of sticks out, and I felt kind of bad about that, because when it's not consistent, like if it sticks out like that, I think it is delegitimating for people, because it like renders their speech as some kind of, like if a non, you know, Trinidadian reader, or somebody not familiar with Trinidad's English Creole would read it, I worry that they would like not take the person's words as seriously because of the way that it's rendered. So I mean, I guess that's why I went into the direction more of, you know, instead of work, just sticking with work. And I do have a lot of, you know, thoughts about that, and some regrets. I think one advantage of not changing the spelling of work is that it allows it to exist in this space of in between, because that's the great thing about Trinidad's English Creole, is that it is that word, but it's not that word, you know, and that's the ground for really rich theorizing. Same way with science. I mean, science isn't really spelled differently, but science is everything that maybe somebody in Canada, you know, that's you know, or somebody in Texas that's like from Texas, that maybe that's all that they, well, nobody's really from Texas, but I mean, it's what they think science is, but it's also more than that. You know, there's so much more in Trinidad's English Creole. And so there's this excess. So one advantage of not changing the spelling is that it doesn't set it apart. And that was a real danger with science, because if I put science in quotes or spelled it differently or italicized it or something, it would make it some kind of ethnically particular. There'd be the risk of making it this kind of ethnically particular term, rather than saying, no, this has something to say to this broad category that's, you know, kind of had an impact everywhere. And so I think, you know, with work, that's a good example, because there is an alternate spelling. And but I think in having the spelling still be W-O-R-K, there is this potential to unsettle what people think that work is more generally, rather than allowing them to pigeonhole it into a kind of particular space of just a Trinidad dialect or something. But Trinidad's dialect itself is global and expansive and incredibly rich. I like showing students Lise Weiner's Dictionary of the English Creole of Trinidad and Tobago, which is like, it's like the OED, it's like that thick, and it's a big dictionary, but it's like all these etymologies and words that are peculiarly Trinidad. There's a really interesting Venezuelan connections too, like mama guy, and a lot of words I'm realizing, and as I do more work with Venezuela, that I have these interesting kind of Venezuelan connections, like mama guy, mamar, I think it's mamar el gallo or mamar gallo. I think like there's all these connections that are really interesting between Venezuela, Trinidad, and then of course Africa, South Asia, etc. So the language is really generative, and I want it to exist in this space of more than one thing and less than two. But I think you could probably do it a lot better than I did. And so that's something that I do think about in the future. The question about, I guess I'll go in reverse order. The question about science. Is historical resistance the cause of Obeah's relation to harm? That's something that I've heard, where people are like, well, the slave had to use Obeah in order to threaten the master or the slave driver who could, so that's why Obeah has this relationship to harm. And I've heard that used in contemporary context to explain the ways that people use intimations of Obeah. For example, a woman is bothered by her neighbor playing loud music all the time. And so, she goes over there and she says, I'm going to call the police, you turn down your music, and he won't turn down the music, just keeps playing it loud. It's only when she goes and like lights a few candles at nightfall in front of her house that, all of a sudden the neighbor like turns down his music, So there's this way that it's understood as the strategic use of this association with harm. And that in those stories, it leaves it open as to whether or not that's just a kind of strategic use of a popular, a shared kind of feeling about Obeah, or whether there is some Obeah happening. That's another interesting in-between space that often happens. As far as Fanon, I think that I cite Fanon maybe in the book or somewhere else, I can't remember, but I cite that particular passage from Wretched of the Earth that you're referring to. And I cite Fanon in other ways too, where he talks about the abyss and blackness as the abyss when I'm talking about the depths, and a kind of way of re-signifying blackness as the abyss through the depths. The depths is not a morally, how would you say, not a morally unredeemed space or something. Like in the spiritual Baptist world, the depths are a very important place that roots and grounds one's journeys in the heights. And so there's not the same idea of above and below, heaven and hell. So I use Fanon in that way, but I think I cite that passage from Wretched of the Earth where he talks about African religions in a certain way that's very French, I have to say. Like it's super, it's really exoticizing in a very French way. It's kind of, I think he describes them as orgies or something. Like he says there's these orgies and people are just like kind of blowing off steam because they're oppressed. And once they get real power, they want you to like blow off steam in this way. It's kind of a very Freudian, or, he's a psychoanalyst, he's coming out of that. So, but yeah, it's an example of kind of maybe a certain attitude towards African religions that is maybe a little bit delegitimizing. So I use it as an example. I can't remember where in the book, but just an example of that more general discourse about African religions as being, well, failed sovereignty in a way. We can talk about that too. I mean, there's this idea, that's a really common idea. I mean, like also in Haiti, and Haiti is often the exemplar of that. They're like, it's because of voodoo that Haiti can't get, their act together and be real sovereigns, and that they're always, like having some failed state situation. And so there's this linkage between African religions and failed state status. I think I talk about that in the high science chapter, where there's this real relationship between like failed sovereignty and African religions and spirit possession in particular. So in Fanon's description, he's talking about like spirit manifestation. Possession isn't the word in Trinidad. Possession in Trinidad, there's another discussion, but we could say manifestation. So there's this interesting relationship between ideas about failed sovereignty, or perhaps like pseudo sovereignty, and African religions, that African religions are providing that, but getting in the way of real sovereignty, which is something that I critique, I think, in the high science chapter. I appreciate all your comments about Obeah, its technology of justice. Obeah's science, is its liminality and ambivalence generative? Yeah, I think so. And there's comments about class and race that are really interesting and complicated and difficult for me to know how to address. But it is true that I'm aware of this when presenting to, for example, a US audience that, of a certain kind, where they assume a certain relation of race is, that police violence is like this relationship of race, basically, between somebody that's white and somebody that's black, which people who really work in these issues, even in the US, know that, I mean, there's police that aren't white. But in the US, it's really a hegemonic white kind of context, and that's valid. But in Trinidad, you're right that the police force historically has been, now its leadership was, the police chiefs haven't typically been what we might call black, although there are some examples. When I was there, it was a Canadian guy that was chief of police, Dwayne Gibbs, who was a Canadian Mountie that they brought in to, I guess, to look good or something. Like people just generally saw him as being like totally inept because he didn't know, like, he's like, this guy's not going to understand Trinidad at all. And the government just has, like, they're like, we'll bring in, this guy, he's going to clean up the situation, but he'll fail like everybody else. So then, but we have a scapegoat at any rate. And so, there was like, so you could say, well, has the leadership been black? But at the rank and file, typically it's been, interestingly, I think there was this historical association between people from Barbados and the police force. So there was this kind of way that the police force was always seen as like foreign, because there was, because Trinidad was a center for migration. People were migrating from what they called the small islands, Grenada, for example, Barbados, St. Vincent, Grenadines. And so there was this kind of adversarial relationship that was set up between different kinds of Black people who wouldn't necessarily in that situation all have called themselves, Afro-Trinidadian, right? And so there's a lot of work on like the history of that category, because, earlier in the 20th century too, Black wouldn't have been, or African wouldn't have been like an identity in common amongst all these people, necessarily the way that it is now. And there were differences in class, there were differences in color that aren't as salient today, but historically, in the way that policing and class happened, that are kind of worth. Maybe I think there should be some work on that. I'm not a historian, but I think that would be interesting. I was thinking about all these old calypsos about colorism and things like that. I'm not recalling the names of them, but at any rate, there's kind of this earlier 20th century discourse about that kind of falls away. Maybe with the Black Power revolution and the forging of this identity African, which really kind of changes things. And so there is this real issue of race and class. But again, I think, Deborah Thomas and other people make the point that, ultimately it's still race, even though, there's still this racialization of class that's happening. So there's like this kind of chicken and the egg thing where it's like, is it race, is it class, which comes first? But I think there's still this way that Blackness still functions in a certain way that has overtones of class. And you're right that there's a religious dimension that's linked to a certain kind of respectable Christianity, and a respectability that other religions can come to enact as well in Trinidad. So I see those as being interrelated projects that, in the book I try to trace this genealogy from this, that maybe anti-Catholic discourses that become anti-African discourses that become, the way that this is kind of spread within, Western, some of the foundational Western discourses about religion and race starting in the 1700s, but drawing on earlier kinds of ideas about religion, blood, and superstition, witchcraft, and those Western European ideas that have a real impact in our foundational and in racialization and anti-African sentiments. Yeah, I think resisting the definitional urge is really important, although it frustrates people. Like they just want to know like what Obeah is. That was a real problem with the book too, like writing up copy and stuff, or with the descriptions of the book. It's like, I think they put a line in the description was like Brent Crosson, like shows what Obeah is or something. I was like, but there's always this push to kind of be like, you are revealing what Obeah is, to somebody, and I really felt uncomfortable with that. So I tried to resist it. Although I was always getting pushed in like a different direction. And it's really interesting, the relationship to spiritual Baptists and that path too of your grandmother. There's so many of these paths, that really also question the ways that maybe some people think about religion, at least, where, like for example, one of the Kali Pujaris that I worked with in Moruga, or Rio Moro, I call it just Moruga. Rio Moro is the pseudonym. He was Christian, became a Muslim, and then finally he, became the head of a Hindu, neo-Hindu Kali temple. So there's all these really interesting stories about people's journeys through what would be thought of as like separate traditions, but. And I emphasize the threefold path, but there's spiritual Baptists who would, again, like I say in the introduction, I emphasize the threefold path because those are the people that I work with. But there's spiritual Baptists that would disavow Orisha or that would disavow Kabbalah, and so this is a kind of, these are contested lines still. But spiritual Baptists and the ritual of mourning really allows this kind of religious cosmopolitanism that's really interesting, where people can be, Hindu in the spirit, Afro-Trinidadian in terms of, census identity, and Christian in terms of religious identity. It's a fairly common thing, within the spiritual Baptist world. And then there's the question that I also always get, and I don't have a good answer for it: how and why Trinidad, why Moruga? And initially I went to Trinidad interested in Hinduism. I worked, I was going to work in the Kali Puja. And so I had really different interests, but then I met this family somewhat randomly in Moruga. And the story is kind of funny how I met them. I go into it a little bit in, I think, the preface of the book. Well, that's not how we first met. That's how they first let me stay at their house. Or actually sleep in a hammock on a neighbor's porch. That was like, I had to sleep on the hammock on the neighbor's porch for a while, and then I slept in my car when I got a car, and then I made my way into the house. Like once I was like tested out a little bit, or seeing like that I could, be somebody that I could be like possibly trusted in some way. Although our relationship was really, we still have a really strong relationship, but it's a complex one too. And so, that family, just like that, I guess I was like, where can I exist in Trinidad? I tried living in Port of Spain. I kind of, I lived at Alice Yard. I don't know if you know Alice Yard. It's like a cultural and art space in Woodbrook. And I guess I was trying to figure out where I could exist. And it was weird because in Moruga, it's like I was totally an outsider. I mean, I was an outsider everywhere, but I mean, in Port of Spain, there was this kind of cultural art scene where I could kind of exist in a certain way. But then it was really just through that family. I don't know. There's something about it that was just kind of random, but also seemed to be fated or something, not well fated, I guess. So it was through that family that I started living in Moruga, and because Moruga is associated with Obeah and Trinidad's national imagination and these issues that came up of there was these quote unquote demonic possessions that happened in the school while I was there, and there's the police shootings, and Obeah played this central role in all these things, and so that's kind of what got me interested in Obeah and the ways that it affected people in Rio Moro and how they were looked at or represented in outside of Rio Moro. And so it was really through that relationship to that family. And without that relationship, I couldn't have worked in Moruga. I had to be attached in some way, or kind of legible in some way, attached to somebody. And so that allowed me to do that work there. And so that's kind of how I stumbled into the project. But I need to get a better answer for that question. So if you have any suggestions, let me know.
I think that's an amazing answer. I love the randomness of when you stumble into field work like that. And I'm sure your interlocutors would say it was the spirits that led you. I know that's what my grandmother would say. So I think just one thing quickly to say what I appreciate. I'm always very guarded when I read ethnographies on Trinidad. It's funny because as an anthropologist, you're used to reading about different people in different communities, but when it's your own, like, especially because I know how deeply felt the stigma my grandmother felt practicing this tradition, from her own family, who was very respectable Church of England Christians, and from the wider Trinidadian society. And so when I saw the title, I was very much like, okay, like I was very cautious. And I think that's why I jumped on the opportunity to respond, not to be like, I'm going to have a verbal spar with this individual, but I just like, I want to know what's being said about my community, And the fact that you resist that definitional urge, the fact that you don't try to simplify these connections, right? I feel like there's also this urge to make things so plain and simple, right? The fact that you highlight all the tensions and the interconnections between these people within the threefold part, who might even not acknowledge that, because my grandmother would definitely not acknowledge Kabbalah or Orisha practices, because that for her was outside of the realm of like the Christian African spiritual tradition that she was entrenched in, right? I think that's what sold me in the book. And that's why I told my mom, Trinidadians should be reading this book, right? Because there is a projection of, or a depiction of Trinidadian society and the issues within Trinidadian society that I almost at times forgot that you were not Trinidadian, right? And I think that is the highest praise you could get from a book because it's like, it's not that I want you to have a fully native perspective, but that your entrenchment with this community and your deep affiliations with them allows you to produce a perspective that's not exoticizing at all, right? And there are few books, especially ethnographies on Trinidad, especially when it comes to religion, that I would say that for. So I love the randomness of it. I love the fact that it's this kind of stumbling upon, because I feel like you didn't come in with this set understanding of what these practices were, or this set, urge to like, redeem Obeah for the whole Caribbean, right? There was not that kind of pseudo colonizing impulse. And I think that's what just makes the text beautiful. Just one more thing, when I told my mom it was Moruga, she actually screamed on the phone, because that's the like reaction to Moruga. It's a place that's legitimately feared. And the next name she mentioned was Papanisa. She was like, oh my God, Papanisa. Like, so that sense of, so I told her, like, this researcher lived in Moruga. She's like, that's a very brave man, right? So again, these ideas about the place and your work, well done. I'll stop talking, but yeah.
Thank you.
Wonderful. There's also this affective exchange about, as you probably answered, I'm just wanting to encourage people to intervene and raise hands once again. I don't, well, if I don't see anything, I'll just step. Oh no, Ashley, go, Ashley.
Hi, Brent. Yeah, no, I'll just say something. I'll say something more for for the students. I mean, I haven't finished the book yet, but it's fantastic. And you know, Brent and I know each other. But what I wanted to say that I thought was so great for students in particular, because I'm actually going to be teaching this in a reading course tomorrow, and it just so happened that this all kind of worked out. So this is funny. But I do think it's so great particularly for teaching, because of this, what Fatima had just talked about, the kind of stumbling into your fieldwork. What does it mean? And what does it mean to do ethnography, right? And I think this book is really exemplary in that respect. Like it's you go in with a project. I mean, it's not that you always have to throw your project away, and nor should you, but you should be open to the ways in which your interlocutors use their words. And these are all the kind of methods that the book brings, right? And so one of the ways that I think students in particular should read this book, particularly before they go to the field, is for, how do you craft an ethnography in process? Like how is an ethnography produced well? And it's produced kind of in process with questions that are subsequently revised in dialogue with your interlocutors. So I thought that was an exceptional part of the book. Particularly for students. I mean, obviously it's theoretically rich, it's ethnographically rich, and the actual events, of course, themselves were, kind of, extraordinary and kind of dictating what you were going to do. But in a way, something that students can get from this book is to really learn how to think on your feet and craft an ethnography as it goes. I recently, and I won't mention the book, but I in the same reading course, I assigned this other book, which has nothing to do with the Caribbean or anything like that. And it was precisely the example of a book which sticks so hard to its original conception, right? That it was very well done. It won a prize, this book, right? So it's not that you can't write a good ethnography or a good book or a book that's recognized as good when you stick to your original object, but something happens when you stick to the original conception. And I'll stop there. Anyway, that was great, Brent, and also Fatima's comments were amazing. So I'll stop there, but thanks very much.
Maybe do you want to respond, Brent, or I take Navin's question?
Well, it's just something that when Fatima and Ashley were talking, I remembered that I really didn't want the book to be about Obeah, and I didn't want Obeah to be in the title, but the press was like, Obeah, should really be in the title, and so I think that's something I wrote the preface that I didn't want to write a book about Obeah precisely because it has all these really charged connotations, and I really wanted spiritual work to be the thing, but then Obeah became the thing. So it's also another example of how I don't know, the twisting path of kind of how these projects work out.
Navin, I'm also aware of time because I know now that lots of questions are going to start. Navin, do you want to?
Yeah. So very similarly to what Fatima was saying earlier, coming into this, sorry, I'm from the Religion 102 class from UFT. Coming into this seminar here, I was, about to focus on what we've been talking about in class, so on and so forth. But then hearing the topics of the discussion, hearing the topics of your book, it really struck a very personal chord with me as well. I'm also from Trinidad, or my mother's from Trinidad. And, I also follow a very non-Orthodox spiritual practice from there. So Kali Puja, which you mentioned, something almost identical, pretty much exactly like that. It's the origins of what's called Kali Puja today, the Mariamman worship from South India, and I also liked how, when you were talking about how Obeah is viewed and how it's used as a tool per se, uh, I also wanted to kind of ask, since you were going into the Kali Puja aspect first, uh, as someone who is of Indo-Trinidadian descent, I find that a lot of Indo-Trinidadians who are not part of Kali worship, who do not also worship the Orishas or spiritual Baptists or follow some sort of non-Orthodox practice, they view a lot of these kind of beliefs as what they would call Obeah as well. Anything that, the manifestations, the rituals, the even Orthodox Hinduism sometimes is referred to as Obeah. So I kind of wanted to just quickly ask, is that something that you've noticed a lot amongst, practitioners of similar type of faiths? So let's say a Kali worshiper, would they refer to, spiritual Baptists as Obeah workers, or would they say an Orisha worshiper is walking Obeah in their yard? Like, is that something you noticed as well? Or maybe an Orisha worshiper calling Kali worship Obeah? Is that something you've seen, or is it something more that they kind of unify for once on against the people who usually call them the Obeah worshippers? Is that something you noticed, or?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question, and there's someone else doing work on this in Guyana about Kali practices getting called Obeah there. Stephanie Jackson, I think is her name. But in my own work, this comes in the book, maybe in the nations section when it's talking about race and religion. I wish I could have written more about the Kali Puja and the work that I did, but it comes up in that I talk about how in Kali temples that I went to, people were self-conscious about that others, including other maybe mainstream Hindus or anybody else, Afro-Christian people could call their practices Obeah. And so the way that came up that I saw was that the leaders of the temple would say we need to be really public about what we're doing, because we don't want people to say what we're doing is Obeah that we're doing it in secret, or we're doing something malevolent in secret. And so they would have these motorcades where they would take murtis, like when they got a new statue, a Hindu statue, they would put it in the back of a pickup truck and like drive it through the streets and have the tapu drummers drumming on the truck, to kind of in a concerted effort to like deflect accusations of Obeah. And so there's this play within. I mean, Hinduism was brought to bear with the same ideas of religion. Of course, it was different. I talk about that in the book too, that there was different processes of racialization, but the same kinds of ideas about respectable religion were brought to bear on Hinduism, as was brought to bear on other peoples in the Caribbean, and so that some of the same practices were relegated to be considered not respectable or savage, those words that were used. And it included spirit manifestation, animal sacrifice, which is really controversial within the Kali Puja, and most Kali temples today in Trinidad don't practice that. It's different in Guyana a little bit, but these, and firewalking and other things, these practices were kind of rendered as being aberrant in the colonial gaze. And so within Hinduism, there's the same relationship, and Hindus were prosecuted under Obeah, anti-Obeah laws. And so one of the things about Obeah is it became this term that could be used against a lot of different people. And you're right, like even for some people, all of Hinduism is Obeah. And then for, within Hinduism, for some Hindus, Kali Puja is Obeah. So in the Kali Puja, somebody who's vegetarian would consider a temple that's, sacrificing animals as maybe doing Obeah. It can be broken down in all these ways where Obeah becomes this dividing line. I think that's what I talk about on Bloodlines, how Obeah is this like constant way of dividing, religion from not religion. And that's, racialized and moralized in different ways.
Yeah,
But
right.
yes, it totally applies. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, I think, when as a Kali worshiper myself, we use the term sada versus balidan, sada versus sacrifice, plain versus sacrifice worship. A lot of these rituals that you have mentioned, the fire walking, the blood sacrifice, the installation pujas with the murti processions and the tapu drumming and whatever, I've been firsthand experience at all of these, and I find within Trinidad, it's the same thing that people view, the Orisha worship and Shango and spiritual Baptist worship as. They view it as something to be feared, something to, when you see the tapu drummers and the manifestations. I also like how you use the term manifestation versus possession. But yeah, how when they see the manifestations, the tapu drumming, the animals being carried by their leashes, they kind of hide in their houses, kind of tell their children don't go outside. Them catching power, they're doing Obeah outside there. These same things that you and Fatima especially have talked about a lot in this seminar. I don't know if you've heard of Keith McNeil's book Trance and Modernity in the Southern Caribbean. In the first line, he
Sorry,
included.
I'm so sorry to cut you off. It's just that we
Mhm.
don't have a lot of time and there are a few other people who wants to ask. I'm so sorry.
Okay, yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Sorry, not to, but I know that Sebastian Mendoza Price has been there for
Oh,
asking.
right.
So
Okay, cool.
kind of, yeah, we'll give turn to everybody. Thank you. Yeah, Sebastian, you're there. Yeah.
Hi, sorry to interrupt, Nevin. So I really appreciate like this conversation, and I actually like bought the book like while like watching this event because I thought it was so interesting. I'm from Venezuela as well. I'm an Orisha worshiper, and it's in my lineage and my family too. And there was an interesting kind of commentary between you and Fatima on and you had mentioned like especially in the Haitian context this external idea of like Haiti being like a failed state or a kind of sub-sovereignty, and that being tied to its religion or its spiritual practices within the country. And in Venezuela, I think some of that can be deployed against Venezuelan populations too, given that the country is in crisis. But Chavez and the Fifth Republic movement and today's manifestation, the PSUV, made a really concerted effort to reach out to these kind of spiritual communities in their project to reassert or a new definition sovereignty that kind of is anti-colonial or falls out of the white supremacist boundaries. So, and today, like the PSUV is very deeply associated with the Maria Leonceros, the Espiritistas, the Orisha worshippers, and that practice is actually like blowing up. In Venezuela, as a way to also kind of for people to proximate themselves to social services or to communities that are service providers. So I guess what my question is, because it's really conflicting sovereignty in what Fatima kind of calls like the liberal state project in the Americas versus Blackness, or in Venezuelan Trinidadian cases like Black and brownness and racial conceptions, is like, does the colonization of Africa and kind of the subservient positions that African states, which did have traditional religions and traditional conceptions of self, that they were put in, kind of manifests in like, or does it have a root in the current conception of religion of African religion as being sub-sovereign? Like, is this sub-sovereignty of African religion used in a way to reinforce white supremacy and white hegemony over moralization, to kind of point out like, well, you can't have a state without Christianity? Like, is that an active discourse in to kind of like assert white supremacy?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, there's so many examples with Haiti, and it's not even necessarily Christian, although there's a lot of Christian invectives, but it could be really secular too. It's like, this is the opiate of the masses. They have voodoo, and they're that's what keeps them like passive or something, and so we need to come in there. And like David Brooks, who was the head of USAID in Haiti, for example, has written these things for like the New York Times, where he's like I think he wrote something called Haiti and the Voodoo Curse, after the earthquake. And this discourse is really active. In Venezuela, it's interesting, well, because in Venezuela, it's all about sovereignty, right? It's a little different. But yeah, I think there's like really interesting about Maria Leonza and the way that Simon Bolivar is deified, and then Chavez has been, put alongside on these altars, and there should be something better written about it. I taught Michael Tausig's The Magic of the State, but it's kind of I don't know. I think there should be something else that, that a book I could teach that was better in English. I show some documentaries though that the state the state film company made, that there's a nice one about Maria Leonza that kind of shows the ways that that a practice that's often also considered aberrant and within Venezuela or feared is practiced by these middle class government functionaries, and there's a kind of diversity they show in sexuality and class and race in terms of the Maria Leonza. I mean, race is an interesting discourse in Venezuela, right? Because it's not it might not be as understood in the same way as in Trinidad or the U.S. perhaps, but Maria Leonza is a really interesting example of the ways that sovereignty actually is embedded into the practice. I mean, Simon Bolivar is like this deified power in Maria Leonza, and there's all these legal aspects too. The Corte Malandro, they have the Viking court, and then all these interesting like things that are intertwined in these practices. So I think really the idea that it's failed sovereignty is wrong. It's just like this racist idea that keeps getting brought up. But the practices are about sovereignty in different ways. In Trinidad, like flag planting and the ways that power is embedded in the landscape and things like that. I think these are really interesting things to think about sovereignty with, rather than it just being about failed sovereignty. Or so I think that's just it's a racist discourse that does have real effects, right? It's like the head of USAID in Haiti like uses that idea to be like, we need to come in and these people don't know what they're doing and need to straighten them out or something.
What was that documentary that you made about Maria Leonza?
I can send it. I can put it in the chat, if you put your email, I'll send it to you.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sebastian. I'll leave it to Connie now, the questions. I just wanted to say the work of Rafael Sanchez of Dancing Jacobins in Venezuela is really very interesting also on kind of Bolivar. And I just wanted to sort of say, for those who do not know in this forum, but with Professor Coleman, who is here, and I'll leave to him the last words to conclude it then later. We have been running this initiative on Entangled World, Sovereignty, Sanctity, and Soil. So the moment of kind of not so failed sovereignty, but sovereignty that also emerges from particular relation to the souls and spiritual work are absolutely at the center of thinking entangled worlds in different ways. Connie, I see the hand.
Yes, actually, talking about Maria Leonza is really good interlude to my question, because we, part of the Entangled Worlds also dealt with Roger Canals Villaju and his work on Maria Leonza, and we were really interested in visual anthropology through the work of Maria Leonza and like the very materiality of her worship. So that kind of segues great into my question, because Brent, I'm very taken by your visual commitments as well in the book, like the evocative images that you supply us with. And I think this is also partly a secondary plug for your cellular ritual visual essay that you submitted to the New Arts of Persuasion. So I'll also link that into the chat because your images are beautiful. But I think I'm really taken by your approach to images because, photography has this kind of scientific element to it. Like when photography first emerged, it kind of had this like God's eye view, to kind of quote your own words on what science does, but you in some ways are changing that approach by giving us these pictures that really are these images that forge these really intersubjective kind of relationality that they're not these scientific images that are typically associated with photography. So I guess I was just interested in the way in which you think of imagery as helping spell out this liminal tradition that you're giving us? So that's just my brief little question.
Brent, yeah.
Thanks. I'll just say briefly, you know, I take photographs with a phone. You know, I'm not a photographer, but I did work with photographers in Trinidad. So it was the photo essay. Those are my photos, but in the book, there's photos of two photographers and myself. The two photographers are Olivia Fern, who's a Trinidadian photographer, and her work, you can find that online. And then Gigi Gatewood, who was from New York, and she was living in Trinidad. She had a Fulbright with me, so that's how I met her. So they really helped me to think about photography. I also tried to make a film with them, and I realized how hard making a film was. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna stick with photography in terms of. But the photography element really has something I feel strongly about in the work, and that was something that I pushed for in the book, was to have a lot of photographs. So hopefully those images kind of helped with the reading of the work.
Absolutely. Simon, do you want to just say maybe a few words, because I know you have another meeting?
I'm sorry, I have to go to another meeting. This is a fantastic discussion. So thank you so much to Brent and to Fatima. I'm just going to say two things before I dash off very quickly. One is one of the things you said right at the beginning, Brent, and I also arrived late, but the shift in the discussion of sovereignty away from discussions of Schmidt to Benjamin, I think is absolutely fascinating. And I think it's actually the kind of Schmittian dominance of so much of our project so far, I think has been very evident. And so there's a certain sense in which you're also, I think, helping us to think in different ways and using a different kind of grounding to think about sovereignty. And then a completely different point is that I love this kind of, and I'm trying to think through this kind of this juxtaposition that in a sense emerges through ethnography that Ashley raised, which is the kind of serendipity of how we emerge into our fields and wrap themselves around us, and your resistance to definition. And it seems to me there's a really interesting kind of juxtaposition of the politics of representation and the ways in which ethnography can work through fields that I think is actually going on there. And to thinking about that in terms of, in a sense, the sovereignty of the press, forcing you to put Obeah in the title. But I'm sorry, I have to go there at that point, but thank you so much. It's a great discussion.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I really agree about Benjamin, and I think it's important to read Benjamin's critique of violence as a critique of Schmidt, because sometimes they're put together in a way where Benjamin and Schmidt actually, I think, wrote to congratulate Benjamin on the essay, because he read it as being like, oh, you're saying like something that supports what I'm saying, but actually it was this sly kind of critique. So I think it's important to think about that in this history of or genealogy of political theology and the way that it's been taken up, to kind of look at it through Benjamin. And I think that's something that Professor Napolitano is doing with in her introduction, also with Martin Buber and Benjamin. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just then ask one question as well that I kind of, because I don't see any other. Please, as I said, call me Valentina. I always feel like, there is kind of reticent to be called, especially in this kind of Zoom, very interesting Zoom talks there is. I really like the idea of opacity. And I'm thinking opacity, you know, the Glissant work on the poetics of relations. You know, there's a whole sort of, and it's not even, and it's a bit even romanticized, Sylvia Winters. There is a kind of, not romanticized, but thinking of opacity as system of, as another way of, another wise of relations that a certain Caribbean scholars and thinkers have been sort of foregrounding. But you are taking at a different level, because these questions of affliction and healing, so the opacity being in that middle, that is not either or, you know, it's not the Aristotelian either or that you actually critique quite well, you know, in the end, about the sort of ethics, religious, you know, the way in which religion has been taken up by people writing about ethics and pious ethics and the Aristotelian poiesis to a certain extent. But I really like that dimension of opacity. So I would like you to ask you a little bit more, how would you make it as a working tool and as a kind of analytical reflection, opacity. I mean, you do it quite well in the book, perhaps if you elaborate so for the people who haven't read it, because I think it's very powerful. Yeah.
That's something that I thought with about Glissant's right to opacity. And I think I took it up more in something else that I wrote that I can't remember what it was, but I think Obeah, I think I talk about it when I'm thinking about the ways that Obeah is kind of exiled from the category of religion by the fact that it's not public, or it doesn't have, it's not visible, and that struggles for recognition are about visibility. In terms of religions getting state recognition, becoming more visible. The thing I mentioned with this particular Kali Puja, again, different Kali Pujas have different orientations, but their response to Obeah was like, we have to become visible, we have to be as visible as possible to people. So they won't say we're doing Obeah because Obeah is something hidden, secret. And so Obeah really made me think about this politics of opacity, of an ethos that's not, whose end isn't visibility, and the value of that, the dangers of that, the stigmas of that. And so I think that the right to opacity is really interesting for rethinking the politics of recognition, for religion and other things as well, being geared towards visibility. And I think I make that point in the introduction that Obeah, again, that's a way that I don't want to, I could say maybe like if Obeah just became like public, if, they did like Obeah demonstrations, there are moves to do that. Like in Jamaica, there was a museum exhibit that was supposed to be kind of, documenting Obeah and showcasing it. Like that's a path towards like legitimation, but I think that's important, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think Obeah also gives pause to think about other ways of thinking about power besides visibility, and the power of opacity, the potentials of opacity. Yeah, so I think I think that Glissant is really interesting to think with in a lot of ways, and that right to opacity. I have to remember exactly how he's, because I went back to him a while ago, and I had some thoughts about this, but I'm not recalling all of them right now. But I think that's a really interesting kind of way to question the politics of visibility. I think I wrote a piece for like, there's something like some cultural anthropology online thing that was called The Politics of Invisibility. And then I think that's when I was thinking about that. But that was like 10 years ago or something, or 8 years ago.
We build upon. And I see Nazar too, and I know a lot of people sort of go over, but please feel free also to get in touch maybe with Brent in his, I don't know, his email at the University of Texas at Austin, to continue the conversation. I know also there are quite a few graduate students, so if he's okay with you, I'll just sort of, in case they are more interested, further interested, to continue this conversation. And I wanted to thank you again, Fatima, for a wonderful set of responses, and really to sort of bring alive the work. The spiritual work is also to bring alive books as what they choose us and we stumble upon. So in that collective spirit of this kind of articulation, I'll look forward. And I just wanted to announce the last one. We are going to have a last one. Connie, the date, I've forgotten, but we have discussing, I should have it with me, but I don't, Hélène Oliphant at NYU, her new book on the banal of
The Art of Being Banal, Catholicism, Art, and sorry, I don't know the full title. It's on April 22nd from 12:30 to 2, the same time.
So I just wanted to highlight that the conversation continues, especially about secularism. Yeah, and public sphere. Thank you very much to all, and looking forward to see you in person soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Valentina, and thanks so much, Fatima, for the really great comments. And and thanks, Connie, for organizing this.
Thanks to you.
Thank you for sharing your work. What a great book. Everybody should just buy it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, do you know Burton Sankarelli by any chance? He's like at any rate, he was I'm trying to get the book there, but it's mostly like through bookstores because every book I send like disappears. But it's in like 2 bookstores there, so I'm trying to like get it to
Yeah. I'm
Looking
definitely
at
going to be telling my friends back in Trinidad about it. I think it's a discussion that has to be had in Trinidad. Few books I would say that about Trinidad, but like I feel like definitely it really pushes us to trouble our. It would make you uncomfortable, and I think that's what Trinidadians need, to be made uncomfortable, especially about our very seamless conceptions about religion and Obeah, and even my mom's reaction to Maruga. It's even as someone raised in the tradition, the reaction to Maruga is one of, right? So we have these knee-jerk reactions